Most women believe that loyalty is love. That staying, waiting, enduring, these are the marks of a good woman, a worthy partner, a queen in waiting. But what if I told you that sometimes, the ones who wait the longest are also the ones who break the hardest? Her name was Elise. And for 7 years she played the role of the loyal woman. She folded herself into that identity like silk into a drawer, quiet, clean, contained. She believed in vows, in slow devotion, in the kind of faith that waits at the door even when no footsteps return. She met Daniel when she was 24, fresh out of graduate school, full of dreams that didn't yet compete with his. He was older, calm, magnetic in that emotionally elusive way that made women think maybe I'll be the one to reach him. A man not cruel, but distant. A prince with a wounded heart. And she, drawn to healing what wouldn't speak its pain. She stayed. When he missed anniversaries, work. When he forgot birthdays, stress. When he pulled away in bed, pressure. There was always a reason, and she, being reasonable, accepted it. Jung called this the anima possession, the woman who merges so deeply with the other that she forgets her own image in the mirror. Elise had become water in Daniel's cup, taking the shape he needed, but losing the taste of herself. She didn't cheat. Not once. Even when loneliness curled beside her at night like a second body. Even when friends stopped inviting her, because, "You'll probably say no, you always do." Even when her mother softly asked, "Do you still laugh?" She stayed. Because she was loyal. Because she thought that love was about surviving yourself. And then, one day, her company sent her on a week-long retreat in Barcelona. She hadn't traveled alone in years. She packed cautiously, like someone who had forgotten what she looked like in sunlight. The airport felt unfamiliar, as if the world had kept moving while she stood still. But something stirred on that plane, something ancient. The shadow. You see, the psyche doesn't forget. It waits, silent, patient, until the body gives it a window. And in Elise, it had waited 7 years. In Barcelona, she met a man. He was not her type, or so she thought. He wasn't Daniel's opposite, not quite, but more like an echo of what Daniel might have been if he hadn't been afraid to feel. He was funny, but not pushy. Confident, but not arrogant. He asked about her, really asked, and listened like her thoughts were books he hadn't read yet. The conversation wasn't sexual. Not at first. It was emotional oxygen. She didn't intend to see him again. But the second night she did. She didn't mean to sleep with him. Not consciously. But the body is wiser than our surface selves. The body knows repression. The body knows starvation. The moment his hand brushed hers, it was as if 7 years of silence need rose from her skin and screamed, "I am still alive." Was it wrong? Maybe. But morality is too small a frame to hold what happened next. This wasn't just about sex. This was about recognition. About the moment a woman sees herself, not through a man's eyes, but through the full ache of her unmet self. She cried afterwards. Not because she regretted it, but because she realized she had been loyal to a ghost. Daniel hadn't cheated on her. But he had abandoned her, emotionally, spiritually. And abandonment wears no scarlet letter. No one tells you to leave someone who isn't cruel, only cold. But Jung knew, the greatest betrayals happen not in action, but in neglect. And loyalty, when unreciprocated, becomes a kind of slow death. In that hotel room, Elise buried 7 years. Not in shame, but in release. She wasn't the same woman who boarded the plane. That version had been curated, edited by expectations, dimmed by devotion. This version was unfiltered. Awake. A little wild. And underneath it all, calm. Like a woman who has nothing left to prove. Because sometimes, loyalty is not a virtue. It's a trauma response. She returned home with a silence that felt louder than guilt. Daniel met her at the airport, kissed her forehead like a father greeting a child, and asked how the trip went without really listening. She answered politely, her voice rehearsed, like someone delivering a weather report. Sunny. Productive. Fine. But inside, Elise felt like a cathedral that had just discovered its stained glass. She had touched a truth too bright to unsee. It wasn't the affair that broke her, it was the contrast. For years, she had made herself small to keep Daniel comfortable. She dimmed her emotions, softened her dreams, swallowed her disappointments like they were vitamins for the relationship. In doing so, she confused survival with intimacy. The stranger in Barcelona had offered her one night, but in that night, she had felt more seen than in 7 years of loyalty. It wasn't about love. It was about remembrance. Carl Jung wrote of the individuation process, the painful unfolding of the self, the integration of the shadow, the reclaiming of what we once disowned. Elise had been the good girl, the dependable partner, the nurturing woman who carried her man's wounds like secret heirlooms. But in Jungian terms, the good girl is often the mask, the persona. And behind the persona lies the shadow, fierce, raw, honest. That night in Barcelona, her shadow came home. She didn't confess to Daniel. Not right away. Because it wasn't about him. It was never really about him. It was about her. The version of herself she had locked away, thinking that silence was loyalty and patience was love. But the woman who slept with that stranger wasn't a cheater. She was the abandoned part of Elise, the wild, laughing, sensual self who had spent 7 years waiting to be let out. She started changing in quiet ways. She stopped apologizing for being tired. She began painting again, even when Daniel said, "Isn't that just a hobby?" She went to bed when she wanted, not when he did. She said no to things she used to endure. It wasn't rebellion. It was reclamation. Daniel noticed, but didn't know what to make of it. He called her moody. Said she was distant. Asked if something was wrong. She smiled gently and said, "Nothing's wrong. I'm just finally listening to myself." And that scared him more than any confession ever could. Because when a woman reclaims herself, she becomes a mirror. And if a man has built his identity around her silence, her awakening will feel like an earthquake. Elise hadn't fallen out of love with Daniel. She had simply seen the architecture of their relationship with new eyes, and realized it had been built on one-sided effort. She had been the sun and the soil. He had simply stood still, waiting for her to bloom around him. For 7 years, she thought she was patient. But now, she saw the deeper truth. She was afraid. Afraid that if she stopped being good, she would no longer be chosen. That if she asked for more, she would be too much. That if she left, she would prove unworthy. That is the illusion many women live under, mistaking compliance for commitment, obedience for love. But loyalty without reciprocity becomes self-erasure. You, too, may have stayed loyal to someone who stopped choosing you a long time ago. You may have mistaken absence for mystery, neglect for stoicism, detachment for maturity. But a man who cannot see you, cannot hold your soul. And a woman who refuses to see herself will forever chase ghosts in the name of love. Elise had finally opened her eyes. She didn't leave Daniel immediately. That's not how these stories go. Women don't break in explosions, they fade out slowly, like candles running out of air. Each day, a little less pretending. Each conversation, a little more truth. The storm had already passed, now came the quiet undoing. She had loved him. Truly. But in the end, she realized something deeper. I deserve to be loved back. There was a night, just weeks after her return, when Elise sat alone in the kitchen and stared at her reflection in the darkened window. The house was quiet, Daniel asleep upstairs, unaware that the woman he thought he knew was dissolving before the moonlight. Her cup of tea had gone cold, untouched. Outside, the world carried on. But inside her, something ancient stirred, a voice not from her mind, but from her bones. You were never meant to disappear inside someone else's silence. That's the tragedy of so many women. We are taught to earn love by shrinking. Taught to understand him before he understands us. Taught to endure emotional droughts with grace, to wear abandonment like a crown, to say I'm fine when we are starving. Elise had learned that lesson well. But now, she was unlearning. One morning, she looked at Daniel across the breakfast table and realized she didn't hate him. And that terrified her even more. Because hating would be easier. Cleaner. It would give her permission to leave. But she didn't feel hatred. She felt emptiness. A soft, sad acceptance that they were not enemies. Just people who stopped choosing each other. Quietly. Slowly. Like a house undone by time, not fire. Daniel still loved her in his own way. But his love was conditional, safe, convenient, abstract. He loved the version of her that didn't need. The version that cheered him on, kept the home warm, asked for little. But when Elise began to show her ache, her longings, her ferocity, he recoiled. Not in cruelty, but in confusion. As if love was only allowed to exist in manageable doses. That's the shadow of many men. They crave devotion, but fear depth. And so she let go, not with a dramatic exit, but with small, daily surrenders. She stopped correcting herself mid-sentence. She started saying what she meant, even if it trembled. She moved her art supplies into the guest room and claimed it as her own space. Daniel noticed. He asked if she was going through something. She smiled softly. "I'm going through myself," she said. This was the individuation process Jung described, the painful, holy becoming of who we were before the world told us to behave. Elise was not becoming a different woman. She was simply coming home. And in this return, she realized something about the stranger in Barcelona. He hadn't saved her. He had awakened her. That night wasn't about infidelity. It was about clarity. The physical act had simply cracked the shell. What poured out wasn't lust. It was the buried truth that she had needs, hunger, fire. That she was more than her role. More than someone's mirror. He never contacted her again. She didn't expect him to. That encounter was never meant to bloom into a story. It was meant to break a spell. In her solitude, Elise began to journal. Long, winding thoughts spilled onto pages she once reserved only for shopping lists and meal plans. She wrote letters to the girl she used to be, the one who waited by the phone, who learned to make herself agreeable, who apologized for having desires. She wrote, "You were enough." Even then. Especially then. Daniel saw her transformation with growing unease. Not because she was cruel, but because she was clear. Clarity is threatening to someone who benefits from confusion. He asked if she still loved him. And she answered, "I love the memory of what we once dreamed. But I can't keep living inside a dream that only I nurture." That was the beginning of the end. There was no fight. No cheating exposed. No shouting in the rain. Just a quiet agreement, like two people standing in front of a dying fire, both knowing it's time to go inside. They parted like grown-ups. Respectfully. With sorrow. With grace. But also with truth. And Elise, for the first time in years, walked away not to prove something, not to punish, not to run. But because she had finally remembered who she was before she gave herself away. Elise moved into a small apartment 2 blocks from the art studio she used to pass every day but never entered. It was the kind of space that echoed when you laughed alone, the kind of place where silence felt honest, not empty. There were no wedding photos to dust, no his and hers towels to fold, no dinners cooked with quiet hope that maybe tonight he'll notice. There was just her. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The first few weeks were strange. Not painful, just unfamiliar. Like waking up in someone else's life, except realizing that someone else was the woman she'd buried under years of compliance. She began to decorate not with the neutral tones Daniel preferred, but with wild, clashing colors that matched the chaos and beauty inside her. Red velvet curtains. Mismatched frames. A corner full of plants she kept forgetting to water, yet somehow they thrived. That's the thing about growth. It doesn't require perfection. Just presence. She enrolled in a painting class, not to become an artist, but to remember what her hands felt like when they created without fear of judgment. The first time she touched the brush to canvas, she cried. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was hers. No performance. No reward. Just self-expression. The sacred act of being. Jung wrote that to become whole, we must integrate what we have rejected. Elise began gathering her fragments, the angry girl, the The sensual woman, the loud one, the one who once dreamed of becoming more than someone's partner. She gave them space at her table. Let them speak. Let them scream if they needed to. And they did. There were nights she grieved not for Daniel, but for herself. For the years lost. For the woman who had waited in the dark for someone to turn on the light, never realizing she had always held the switch. She mourned the tenderness she had wasted, the patience spent on someone who saw her as dependable furniture, always there, always quiet, always useful. But she didn't hate him. Hating him would have made him the center of her story. He no longer was. This was not a revenge arc. It was a resurrection. And then, slowly, the world began to notice. Not the men. Not yet. But women. Women at the studio, at the cafe, on the train. They looked at her with recognition. Like they, too, had once disappeared for love. Like they saw in her a woman who had walked through fire without turning into ash. She didn't speak of the stranger in Barcelona. That night didn't need retelling. It had already served its purpose. She understood now that he wasn't the one, he was the mirror. The symbolic archetype of the animus awakened, the masculine energy inside her, daring her to reclaim her power, her desire, her agency. Because the truth was never about choosing between Daniel and the stranger. It was about choosing herself. Some women live their entire lives without doing that. They die loyal, faithful, selfless, and quietly hollow. But Elise had broken the spell, and she began to see through new eyes. The romantic myths she had clung to unraveled. She no longer believed in, forever, as a measure of success. She stopped idolizing endurance. What mattered now was truth, intimacy with the self, connection without codependency, desire without distortion. She no longer apologized for wanting depth, passion, reciprocity. She no longer made herself smaller to keep the peace. Her standards were not punishments, they were boundaries born from self-worth. And one day, as she walked past the bookstore window, she saw her reflection. Sunlight hit her hair just right. She paused and smiled. Not because she looked beautiful, but because she looked real. Not filtered through someone else's gaze. Not measured by someone else's need. Just her. Elise. The woman who waited. The woman who stayed. The woman who left. The woman who returned to herself. There was a peace that followed, not the loud kind that dances with fireworks, but the quiet one that comes when you no longer betray yourself just to keep someone else's story going. Elise began to understand that the love she had once begged for was always meant to begin within. The more she honored her own voice, the less she needed to be validated by someone else's. And that changed everything. She no longer dated to feel wanted. She dated only when she felt whole. She wasn't waiting to be chosen anymore, she was choosing. There were men, of course. Some intrigued by her depth, others intimidated by it. She saw the dance of projection now, how people don't fall in love with you, but with the mirror you unknowingly hold up to them. One man adored her sensitivity, until it made him confront his own numbness. Another loved her independence, until it meant she wouldn't beg for him. She didn't take it personally anymore. She had danced in those illusions once. She knew what it meant to confuse chemistry with compatibility, attachment with devotion, chaos with passion. Her clarity scared away the ones who weren't ready. And that was a blessing. In Jungian terms, Elise had become an individuated self, a woman who no longer split herself into roles, masks, or performance. She had met her shadow, danced with it, integrated it. She could now look at her reflection, not for approval, but for connection. There was one evening, months after she had left Daniel, when he reached out. A message. Simple. Tentative. I saw one of your paintings online. It's beautiful. I hope you're doing okay. She stared at the screen for a long moment. There was no anger in her. No longing. Just a soft awareness that he, too, was on his path, one that had taken a different turn. She typed back, "Thank you. I am." And she was. not because she had found someone new, but because she had found something better, a home inside herself. A place where she could feel all of it, desire, rage, softness, hope, without shame. There is something divine about a woman who no longer begs to be seen. A woman who remembers that her worth is not a negotiation. A woman who knows that betrayal, even when it breaks her, can also awaken her. She would never again hand her soul to a man who offered only his presence when it was convenient. Never again bend until her spine forgot its shape. Never again wait for breadcrumbs of affection while starving in silence. You see, some women don't leave when they're hurt. They leave when they're finally healed enough to walk away. Elise had become that kind of woman. And in doing so, she became dangerous, not because she was cruel, but because she was free. Free from needing to be understood by those who only knew how to love the version of her that stayed quiet. Free from guilt. Free from the idea that she had to earn what should have been given willingly. This is the woman many men fear, the one who will not collapse into their absence. The one who knows her soul is not a consolation prize. She became fire and stillness all at once. Unapologetic. Soft. Sharp. Whole. And one day, maybe she would meet someone who could hold that wholeness. Someone who would not shrink in her light. Someone who would not ask her to be less in order to be loved. But until then, and even if never, she was already enough. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever stayed too long, loved too hard, or lost yourself trying to be enough, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Like it if you've ever been her. Comment if you've found your way back to yourself. And if you want more stories like this, rich in emotion, layered with psychology, and steeped in truth, subscribe for weekly narratives that don't just entertain. They dissect the soul. This is Psych of Love. We don't just tell stories. We uncover the why beneath them.